Hello and welcome to today's webinar titled Municipal Risk and Return on Investment Tool. This webinar is made possible with funding supported by Natural Resources Canada through the Ontario Regional Adaptation Collaborative. My name is Suzanne Sealing and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I am an Adaptation Extension Liaison at the Climate Risk Institute. If you run into audio or technical issues during the webinar, open the chat box and using the drop-down arrow, locate the name Suzanne Sealing and you can send me a private message. Please note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distraction or feedback. There is a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the webinar, but that doesn't mean you have to hold your questions until then. Please feel free to type them out during the presentation in the chat box. We are recording the webinar today and we will send out a link to everyone who has registered. Now I would like to introduce our speakers. Christine Zimmer is a Chief Specialist in Watershed Risk Assessment at Credit Valley Conservation Authority. She is recognized as an expert in integrated climate risk management and adaptation strategies for watershed management and green infrastructure. Christine is committed to sharing CVC's leading edge research and technologies, having led more than 40 conferences, reaching over 6,000 professionals and community members over the last 15 years. Amna Tarek is a water resources engineer in the watershed projects at the Credit Valley Conservation. Amna joined CVC in 2010 and currently works in climate change research and development, which includes tackling new and emerging impacts from climate change on water resources and water infrastructure. Her key interest is in developing technical tools which address these impacts with the purpose of streamlining climate change risk and vulnerability assessments and building flood resiliency. On behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a really warm welcome to Christine and Amna for presenting this webinar for us today. It is very much appreciated. And so without further ado, I will turn things over to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, Suzanne. I appreciate that. So thank you all for joining us today. What we'd like to do is just step back and give you a little bit of an overview of where we are in the Credit Valley Conservation and give you some context as to how and why we developed the Risk and Return on Investment tool. And then Amna is going to share with you some details on the Risk and Return on Investment tool. And I will then, if there's time, we can also provide you with a virtual tour of the tool. So sit back, and if you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. Next slide, Amna. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Credit Valley Conservation Authority is one of 36 conservation authorities in Ontario, and we manage our resources on a watershed basis. And primarily we started with respect to flood and flood mitigation and floodplain management. But we also do quite a significant role in natural heritage and protection of wetlands and resources. And provide support and guidance to our municipal partners from a watershed and resource perspective. The Credit Valley Conservation Authority is between our big neighbors, Toronto and Hamilton. And our watershed is 1,000 square kilometers. It starts in the headwaters by Orangeville, for those of you who know Ontario, and flows down to Mississauga. We like to think of ourselves as a lovely living lab because at the headwaters, we have very groundwater sensitive municipalities. As we move towards the middle part of the watershed, we have some of the fastest growing municipalities. And then towards the outlet is the city of Mississauga, which was largely built out prior to 1980s without flood control standards. And so it's a great living lab in order for us to really understand the interactions between our natural environment and our built environment and how we can protect our resources. And again, the credit empties into Lake Ontario. Next slide, Amna. So we are very fortunate at the Credit. We work very closely with our municipal and regional partners. And one of the things that we worked on in 2017 was a climate risk assessment that looked at water, wastewater, stormwater, and the watershed, and how might it be impacted by climate change. And we looked at various climate parameters such as temperature, more rain than snow. And we also looked at extreme events such as rainfall, wind. And what we found in that study, and looking at the integration between water, wastewater, stormwater, and the watershed, was that the largest threat to this integrated system was from extreme rainfall events. And I think one of the great parts of this study was that we worked collectively across the partnership with the region of Peel, our lower tier municipalities, Mississauga, Brampton, Caledon. And then we also worked across municipal services. So from emergency management, public health, planning, public works, transportation, parks and recreation. And this really gave us the opportunity to look at what are those extreme risks that happen during an extreme rainfall event? Because sometimes it's very difficult to understand what our future may look like in 2050 or 2080. My husband reminds me that, you know, I'll be 80 years old at 2050 and likely not alive at 2080. So it's hard to really understand and appreciate sort of what that future may look like. But looking at past events, we were really able to engage each other and understand how each of our services were impacted by these extreme rainfall events, and also what our municipal risks were, or what our roles and responsibilities were during these events. So when we think of flooding, a lot of times people think just of riverine flooding. So when the banks overflow, and that's largely been the responsibility of the Conservation Authority to predict when the banks may overflow. But there are other types of flooding. So urban overland flooding, particularly in these older areas that weren't built to flood control standards of today, where there's nowhere for the water to go. And so it spills over our roadways, onto our properties and into our homes. There's also sanitary backup when stormwater enters into the sanitary system, or groundwater enters into the sanitary system and ends up overwhelming the sanitary system and backs up into our basements. Groundwater flooding is an emerging issue. And some of the things that are a little less known or thought about during extreme events are impacts of water quality. So that lower picture in the lower middle is actually the pollutant plume that came from the Credit River on July 8th in 2013, when we had that big GTA storm. The other thing that's often forgotten is the impact and the cost and safety risks associated with erosion. And so you see that picture on the lower left. Next slide, Amna. When we engage our other departments and services, I think some of the things that we identified as sort of near misses that happened on those extreme events were highlighted. So for instance, on the left, we noted that evacuation plans typically consider fire, but they don't include flooding. So we had a school that had 4 feet of flooding in the kindergarten in less than a half an hour. Fortunately, the extreme event happened in the summer when there was no school, but it did highlight that we need to start to think about evacuation planning for flooding, and we need to be able to map where that flooding may occur and which social vulnerable populations do we need to particularly consider. So schools, daycares, senior care facilities, and hospitals. One of the other near misses was a train track that was undermined by erosion. And had it not been for a dog walker that walked by, called 911 and stopped the train, this could have had impacts to public safety. And so it really highlighted for emergency managers who typically only think about, you know, large event planning or plane crashes as part of potential emergency management threats, that critical infrastructure can also pose a threat to the public. And so that also required us to start to think, how do we map out or identify critical infrastructure that could be potentially pose risks to safety? I think one of the things that really has driven me and made me passionate about flood mitigation is the stories that I saw of the people that were impacted. Meet Ken Hill. He lived in a tent while his basement apartment was being renovated. And this is particularly, I think, why we're all here as public servants, to really protect and to think about in our planning decisions, how can we best support individuals that are less resilient to these kinds of extreme events. Next slide, Amna. I think one of the things we also are aware of is the economic impacts. I heard a Fortune 500 company after Hurricane Harvey saying, you know, I can handle one of these events and the implications to cost, but I can't handle multiple repeated events. And in Mississauga, we had an extreme event that occurred in 2009 and an extreme event that occurred in 2013. Where I live in Toronto, we had the July 2013 event, and then we had the July 8th, 2020 event. So these are extreme events that are happening frequently and are causing economic impact to both residents and private businesses. I mentioned that pollutant plume of the Credit River. And one of the things that we're seeing with these more extreme events is increased pollutant loading and concentrations. And with the warmer temperatures, we're seeing that exacerbates algae growth, which has an impact on drinking water intakes. And in this case, the region of Peel had to shut down the drinking water intake pipe to be able to clean out the algae that was clogging the filters. So again, those pose some additional safety concerns and risks and damages that we don't always think about when we think about flooding. There's also the public health risks. So when people have basement flooding due to sanitary or overland flooding or groundwater flooding, there are pathogens associated with that. And so these are things that we need to start to think about as we start to see an increasing demographic with more vulnerable conditions or chronic conditions. Next slide, Amna. So why are we seeing flooding? And where are these vulnerabilities? And I think one of the things that I think is important to know that's different than stormwater, that's different in water and wastewater. For those of us who live in a municipality, we all get the same drinking water and to our tap, regardless of whether my house was built in the 50s or your house was just built 2 years ago. That's not the case for stormwater. When we're talking about stormwater, it has evolved. And so properties and neighborhoods that were built prior to the 80s were built prior to flood control standards. And so in some municipalities, that can be quite a sizable amount of the urban development, which is the case in Mississauga and a large portion of the Greater Toronto area. There are other municipalities where less of they are developing now, and so they have newer technology or newer stormwater as a portion of their urban fabric, but they may have other constraints. Small municipalities have less resources to go back and retrofit certain areas. So one of the big things I think is important to take note is that not all developments have the same level of stormwater service. And how do you bring these different neighborhoods to the same level, or do you? And that's some of the struggles that we face in stormwater management. Next slide. So as I was mentioning, I think one of the biggest challenges in stormwater management today is what level of risk are we willing to accept? What level of service can we actually achieve in those older areas? When you start to look at municipalities in the Greater Toronto area where you already have, largely built out urban areas, very little open space to put in conventional storm ponds, how do you build resiliency? What are your options? And what is climate change going to bring? Next slide, Amna. So when we're faced with those questions, we often look at what's our liability, our exposure to liability. So, and to answer some of those liability questions, we look at what are other municipalities doing to address this. And one of the challenges with stormwater is that we don't have clear standards or guidelines on assessing level of risk and level of service, unlike drinking water, where it's no fecal coliform. That's not the same case in stormwater. So again, there's differences across municipalities in how they're addressing it because they're largely sizing stormwater on a watershed basis. Another question when you're looking at legal risk and liability is, have we made justifiable and documented policy decisions, and are we implementing our policy decisions? One municipality had a roof leader disconnect project bylaw, but failed to implement it. And so they had a legal suit against them for failure to implement. And so that's one of the things I think that we need to think about when we form policies or recommendations. How are we going to implement it? How do we justify if we can't implement something due to fiscal constraints? Documenting decisions, is really important in order to demonstrate duty of care. So another question when we're looking at common law principles is, was the event foreseeable, and were the actions reasonable? So if, for instance, you don't have the financial mechanism to go and inspect homes to make sure that people are disconnecting the roof leaders, if you document that you don't have that financial feasibility to do that, but you're going to adopt more of a complaint basis, or when residents apply for permits, that's when you would check. That's a defensible and reasonable mechanism in which to implement policies. Next slide. One of the things, again, as I mentioned, is that because there's less definitive standards for stormwater, we also want to look at what does the province and the federal government tell us we need to achieve for level of service and level of risk. And so in looking at the province of Ontario, we have sort of two really guiding principles when it comes to sort of stormwater and land use planning, I should say. So the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe and the PPS really talks about the fact that stormwater master planning must be informed by watershed and subwatershed plans, and we must look at the cumulative impacts. The Ontario Regulation 588, which is an asset management regulation, requires municipalities not just to put in infrastructure, but to maintain it, and to also consider climate vulnerabilities. So that may mean that a pond would need to be cleaned out more frequently due to climate change. There's also some federal direction when it comes to stormwater management. So the requirement under the climate change lens is to look at your climate risks, to look at when you're proposing an infrastructure, is it demonstrating that it's the best return on investment, and that you've looked at the economic, social, and critical infrastructure impacts. Next slide. One of the pieces of work that we're working on today, and I think as part of our work with our partners, is really trying to integrate watershed planning into master planning and asset management planning. It's been a difficult process because there really isn't guidelines and standards on how to do that. And so one of the things, and one of the reasons we developed the risk and return investment tool, which Amna is going to present to you, is that we needed a way in which we could translate watershed targets into something that you could evaluate and use in asset management and master planning. So typical asset management planning says they look at what is the customer level of service. So from a customer perspective, I don't want to experience flooding. The piece that's been missing has been the watershed piece. And so we're proposing to use the risk and return investment tool, but you can obviously use other tools to develop a target that can then be integrated into asset management. So in this example, maintaining the existing flood damages under the 2050 scenario might be a target that you would use in asset management. And so then you want to evaluate the technical level of service, which is sort of what are the stormwater management tools that you need to be able to achieve that target. So one of the reasons we wanted to develop the risk and return investment tool, which Amna will talk about, is so that we can build it into and integrate it into our master plans and our asset management plans, so that we can start to address some of those questions around level of risk, level of service, and what's feasible and reasonable. Next slide, Amna. So again, part of the reason, one of the things that we were grappling with when we did the vulnerability study is what are taxpayers willing to pay? And how do we prioritize investment? And how do you compare a storm pond to gray infrastructure or green infrastructure and natural assets? And when we started to look at the different tools available, we didn't find that there were tools available in 2017 that allowed us to really answer those questions. And so we developed the risk and return investment tool with our partners, with partial funding from the federal government and others. And with that, I will turn it over to Amna.
Great, thanks, Christine. So the risk and return on investment tool was really designed to address the various questions that Christine highlighted earlier, particularly in light of the updated regulations. We also want to recognize that this was a joint effort with federal funding alongside our municipal and regional partners, as well as academia supporting research, professional associations, and conservation authorities providing technical peer review and case study data. So let's talk about the conceptual model. As Christine also indicated earlier, there's various types of flooding, and the tool is designed to assess those various types of flooding. So I'll reiterate, we're talking about riverine, urban overland, groundwater flooding, sanitary sewer backup, as well as erosion. The tool then quantifies the economic, social, and environmental impacts. So let's start with economic impacts. This looks at direct and indirect damage to buildings, infrastructure such as roads, railways, and critical infrastructure such as water mains, sewer networks, gas lines, or telecommunication lines. If buildings or critical infrastructure are within a flood or erosion risk area, the tool calculates a direct damage, such as property damage or the need for infrastructure repair. The tool also calculates indirect damages, such as residential displacement or business interruption, which are typically not considered in flood evaluation studies, especially as Christine highlighted earlier with the example of Ken Hill. For social impacts, the tool has developed a correlation between the event-based water depth and velocity information and the potential for an injury or fatality to occur in a highly populated area that is within the risk areas, or disease outbreaks where population are potentially coming in contact with urban overland and sanitary floodwaters. The environmental impacts, the tool calculates stream degradation due to erosion, and we're talking about both event-based and long-term stream degradation. And the tool also calculates potential damage to buried infrastructure due to exposure from erosive flows within the stream under various storm events. The assessments within this tool can be performed at various scales. So for example, watershed scale versus community scale. The example that you see in the map on the left shows a case study area where the tool was applied on a watershed scale to assess erosion impacts such as stream degradation and critical infrastructure exposure or failure. The zoomed in figure in the middle shows the tool's application on a community scale to better understand urban overland flooding that may be occurring locally in that pink area. And other assessments can also be performed at either of these scales, as we have discussed a bit earlier. So we're talking about riverine flooding, sanitary sewer backup, groundwater flooding, as well as the various health impact assessments. Prior to the development of the tool, we hosted a series of webinars across Canada to get a sense of what levels of geospatial and modeling data do we generally have. Based on this information, the tool was developed to allow users at both ends of the spectrum, so users with lots of data and models and users with minimal data, to be able to utilize the tool and highlight high-risk areas and do some damage quantification and mitigation assessments as well, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. But typical data needs include digital elevation models, your area of interest, floodplains, infrastructure layers, in a shapefile format, and also model inputs include results from any hydrologic or hydraulic models that we have for the particular study area. We take the results from these models in the forms of shapefiles or rasters and bring them into the tool. And then again, in areas where the user does not have the necessary models, for example, a PC swim model, the risk tool has been programmed to employ an alternative method which looks at slopes, percentage impervious, land use type, digital elevation model to help define high urban flood risk areas. This slide outlines the source data that is hosted within the backend of the tool to perform the various damage computations. The source data includes infrastructure costing for sewers, roads, railways, etc., depth damage costing per building type, life cycle costing for the management options, or what we call gray or green infrastructure, as well as natural assets, demographics or population data from Statistics Canada, again, digital elevation models or provincial superficial geology data, and we're currently developing a social vulnerability index method that will be brought into the tool. The tool can be assessed on an event basis. So here are some preliminary results for a 100-year storm for 2 of our case studies. So case study 1 was on a watershed scale assessment, and case study 2 was a neighborhood or community scale assessment. For case study 1, the tool highlighted buildings prone to riverine flooding, as shown in red, and urban overland flooding, as shown in orange. These results were compared with historic flood complaints data, shown as the blue circles, to validate tool results and build confidence. For case study 2, the tool highlighted buildings prone to groundwater flooding in blue and urban overland flooding in orange. The tool then calculates the direct damages, as we discussed earlier, to each of these buildings based on the depth of flooding at each home, as shown in the summary tables here. The financial quantification is important because this is a financial tool and we want to get a sense of what the overall damages are. When we get to the point of applying mitigation measures, we also want to get a sense of those damage reductions, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. The damages can also be represented graphically as shown in this slide and can be further broken down by the type of flooding and types of buildings or infrastructure affected. This helps the user understand the dominant flood type within the study area, which is important for selecting the appropriate mitigation measures. For example, in case study 1, the dominant flood type is urban overland flooding, which may potentially require targeted lot level controls for building risk reduction. For case study 2, groundwater flooding was the dominant flood type, requiring measures like basement foundation sealing or multiple sump pumps. The tool also identifies infrastructure at risk of erosion under the various return period storms due to high erosive flows and an increased stream power. Figure on the left shows the infrastructure that is at risk of exposure under a 10-year storm and subsequently would be exposed under a larger storm, for example, a 100-year storm. So in the map, the different colored lines represent various infrastructure. So sanitary sewers, storm sewers, gas lines, telecommunication lines, or water mains, which are within or they're crossing the stream where the stream power is predicted to be really high under the various storms. And this helps the user better understand priority asset upgrades to ensure that vulnerable critical infrastructure is protected. The graph on the right shows the erosion damage to the various buried infrastructure under the various return period storms. So we really need to strike the right balance. Traditional solutions to address urban flooding include green infrastructure, protection and enhancement of natural assets, and gray infrastructure. By understanding the impact that a lack of stormwater management costs a city in emergency management or public health, it really made us realize that some solutions are not just infrastructure related. Solutions such as land acquisition along the floodplain and compatible land use were critical solutions to reducing municipal risk. For example, not putting vulnerable populations or facilities such as schools, daycares, senior facilities in known flood-prone areas. We also looked at examples from tornado-prone areas in the US, and we found that a critical step in reducing loss of life was emergency management, education, and outreach. And in the US, where there were effective drills and warnings, the mortality rate was also lower. So taking these lessons, we have begun to look at how we can improve evacuation plans and education and outreach in flood-prone areas where the response time is really short. The tool also incorporates groundwater data, such as area where the groundwater is within 1 meter from the surface. And in that case, the tool alerts the user that infiltration practices are not recommended as the mitigation measure, given the high groundwater table. So those types of analyses or data are also brought into the tool to help the users guide as much as possible as to picking the best mitigation measure to address flood risk. The tool calculates what we call an average annual damage, which allows municipalities to then compare the various mitigation options, such as gray, green, or natural assets, and to understand their return on investment or their ability to avoid potential damages. So the orange bar that you see on the screen in the graph represents the baseline average annual damages under existing and future climate scenarios for case study 1 that we showed earlier. And under 2050 and 2080, the storm event probabilities are adjusted for climate change, under which these events would become more frequent and the damages would also be incurred more frequently. After the implementation of gray infrastructure, such as detention facilities or stormwater management ponds, as shown in the blue bar, the damages are reduced by 2 million under existing climate and 4 to 6 million under future climate scenario. Again, keep in context, this particular management option targeted riverine flooding, riverine and erosion only, which represented 20% of all the damages experienced in this case study. After the implementation of low impact development through green development standards, as shown in the green bar, the damages can potentially be reduced by 4 million under existing and 5 million under future climate scenarios. This addressed urban overland flooding particularly, which we know was the dominant flood type for this case study, but not all areas that were mitigated overlapped with the high-risk areas. And we'll talk about later how targeting these high-risk areas represent a better option for getting the best bang for your buck. And Christine will talk about that in a later slide based on the outputs that you get from the tool that can help us target those really high-risk areas. Natural assets can also be evaluated in the tool. And as we can see here, none of the management options allow us to maintain that existing average annual damage under 2050 and 2080, as Christine highlighted earlier. So this tool does allow us to evaluate the different watershed level of service targets and determine what is their feasibility and costs. Just a side note on natural assets, through external funding, we have developed a comprehensive life cycle costing database for natural assets such as wetlands, open space, and forests. And these costs are being utilized in the risk tool to assess mitigation through natural asset creation. Now let's talk about return on investment. So planning plays a critical role in flood resiliency. As pointed out, damages due to riverine flooding represented only 20% of the flood damages for case study 1, demonstrating the effectiveness of floodplain management. Green development standards, such as requiring green roofs, permeable pavement, rain gardens, are another planning tool for greenfield, infill, or redevelopment scenarios. And in speaking with our planning partners, they expressed the need for building the business case for green development standards as they faced pushback for increased stormwater management requirements. So for case study 1, this slide provides an example output of the net present value comparison of the green development standards constructed by the developers for new development versus the municipality retrofitting existing urban areas with stormwater management ponds. Please note that this graphic needs to be put in context with the slide on the average annual damages that I showed earlier for case study 1. And again, just to reiterate, in neither the green development standard or the pond scenario alone maintain existing damages under 2050 or 2080 scenarios. And this year, our partners will be running additional scenarios, stormwater management scenarios, to see what options can maintain that existing average annual damage and potentially meet the water level of service example that Christine presented earlier. For case study 2, we found that both the management options, the LID and the pond rehabilitation, yielded a positive net present value, which is a positive result. The tool also calculates an internal rate of return as another form of return on investment. An internal rate of return is really an interest rate that would need to be applied to achieve the corresponding net present value that we discussed earlier in the earlier slide. And in talking with financial experts, we found that an internal rate of return greater than or equal to 2% is considered a good investment because it is similar to a GIC bond. Now I will pass it on back to Christine to talk about how our municipalities are using the tool results.
Thanks, Amna. If you just move to the next slide, thanks. So I just wanted to make one quick comment regarding the options that Amna had mentioned in the average annualized damage calculation, and that is for the Green Development Standard, we were limited to the green, to basically new development and to retrofit. So, sorry, new development only, not retrofitting. So that was less than 10% of the urban area. So, and again, these are case study examples. So please keep that also in mind in context. So one of the things that Amna mentioned is that when you think about that average annualized damage graphic, that just putting in green development standards for new development, particularly in areas where you have very limited new development or greenfield, doesn't allow you to maintain existing damages. You've got to go back and retrofit existing urban areas to build resiliency. And so targeting areas is what we found to be in some of our case studies to be the best bang for your buck. So there are different ways in which you can prioritize where you do investment. This graph on the, or the map on the left is looking at total damages, both erosion from and private and public flood damages. And so the darker the red, the darker, the higher the damages in that particular neighborhood. So for instance, in the dark red neighborhood, that might be where you would target outreach to have property owners put in lot level controls, green roofs or rain gardens, or where you might want to target road retrofits for lot level controls. The map in the middle is if you wanted to target riverine flooding. So the dark or the blue, those are catchment areas where the largest contribution to riverine flooding. Those would be areas where you'd want to target a pond. The map on the far right is the darker the brown. Those are neighborhoods where you would want to target urban flood mitigation measures. Next slide, Amna. We talked about, the Ken Hills, and we talked about the pathogens from sanitary and overland flooding. And we also talked about social vulnerable populations, schools and hospitals. And so one of the things that the tool looks at is priority mapping for social vulnerable populations. So it looks at both flood depth and velocity, as well as social vulnerable layers like schools, neighborhoods, and senior care facilities, daycares. And then it also looks at potential health impacts and overlays that with your social vulnerable layer. And so the dark red neighborhoods are areas where you might want to target emergency management, so flood evacuation planning for riverine flooding in some of these particular neighborhoods, where you might want to target public health or emergency preparedness outreach materials. Just to give you a sense of, we all play a part, as Amna said, in adaptation. This may also be an area where you might want to look at land acquisition for parkland. So maybe some of these areas, the response time in the river might be so quick that you might want to instead look at some of these properties as opportunities to acquire land to increase parkland. One of the things that Amna talked about when she was talking about net present value and internal rate of return is you need to understand the life cycle costing of your management option. So one pond may need to be cleaned out every 7 years, some may every 20 years, depending on what's draining to that pond. And so one of the things that the tool does from a purely GIS land use perspective in working with the University of Guelph is developed a tool, a module that allows you to look at a high level. It doesn't replace inspection and monitoring, which ponds may need to be cleaned out more frequently based on land use. And so the darker the brown, those would be ponds that you would need to clean out more frequently than the lighter colored ponds. Next slide, Amna. One of the things that we have found when we've worked with our municipal partners is the opportunities to get co-benefits. So looking at areas where you have critical infrastructure that may be at risk and overlaying that with natural heritage systems to see whether there's opportunities for restoration from aquatic or natural restoration opportunities. Next slide, Amna. One of the other things that I mentioned just briefly was looking at opportunities for parkland. So many municipalities are looking to expand their parkland. Overlaying that with some of the risk mapping allows you to identify where there are opportunities both in the urban tablelands as well as along the river where you might want to increase or enhance parkland and have the multiple benefit of reducing flood risk. Next slide, Amna. And again, as we mentioned, the tool allows you to have these priority maps in which you can look at prioritizing emergency planning, emergency outreach, and evacuation planning. Next slide. One of the things we've also done is looked at the tool from a perspective of scenario modeling. And so taking those high risk maps that I mentioned, that urban map that highlighted the areas where there were neighborhoods that were high risk, and looking at what are the different strategies that we can do to target flood resiliency, whether that's looking at your greenfield infill development, targeting those. So those are the yellow and green areas, whether that's looking at retrofitting industrial commercial areas through green development standards or stormwater rate charges and credits. And then also looking at your municipal roads program. Are there neighborhoods and residential neighborhoods where you could target residential retrofits within the road right away? So looking at different options to be able to then evaluate their return on investment. Next slide, Amna. So again, that was from a flood perspective. You could also look at it from a water quality perspective. So if you have 30 or 300 ponds, as some municipalities do, how do you reduce your cleanouts? If you could start to target, IC sectors for putting in lot level controls, you might be able to reduce the sediment loading going to a particular storm pond. So looking at different ways to reduce life cycle costing as well as reducing flood risk or water quality risks. Next slide. So one of the things we have not discussed in this presentation is the fact that the tool also can look at sanitary sewer backup, groundwater flooding with respect to riverine connected and high groundwater tables, looking at indirect damages associated with residential business displacement and business interruption. And some of the future elements that we're bringing in is the social index vulnerability mapping. So we have, I should say, we're enhancing the social vulnerability mapping that we have developed to date. One of the other elements that we're hoping to bring in to help support Infrastructure Canada's climate change lens requirement is the ability to compare GHG emissions between management options that are being evaluated. So if you're putting in, let's say, ponds versus a low impact development, what are the GHG emissions produced by those two scenarios? And then also recognizing that this is an event-based model, not a continuous model, looking at, are there opportunities for us to bring in water quality to be able to support looking at more deeply at water quality benefits and sort of tying that to a cost benefit analysis. Next slide, Amna. So in closing, I think there are still things and advancements in the tool that we'd like to do. We are now at the stage where we have completed version 1 of the tool and are looking at opportunities to release it more broadly beyond our jurisdiction. If you are interested in more information on the tool, feel free to contact myself or Umna. I'm not sure how we're running for time. If we've got, I guess we've got 15 minutes. So, and I think we have 8 questions in the chat box. If we get through those chat box questions, we may have some time for some, just a virtual tour of the tool so that you can actually see that it exists. With that, I'll turn it over. I don't see the chat, so I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Great, thanks so much, Christine. You're right, we've got about 15 minutes left. So let's jump right into the questions. The first question is from Baya. Did you use the past data to build future assumptions for 2050 of climate change? If so, which was the climate scenario that you used in order to assess these impacts, such as RCP 8.5 or RCP 4.5?
I can take that one. It's Amna here. We used our CP 8.5, and the way the tool incorporates the 2050 and 2080 climate adjustments is that it adjusts the annual probability for each of those events, and it is rolled into the average annual damage calculations that we do in the tool, which kind of take into account each event that you've analyzed with respect to its annual probability. It annualizes the damages, and based on the climate change modeling built into the tool, the probabilities are adjusted, and so are the damages for 2050 and 2080.
So we should just add that these are examples that we provided, but the user can put in other climate scenarios themselves. So as Amna said, for these examples anyways, we use the 8.5 and the 2050 and 2080 scenarios, but users are able to put in their own scenarios, and they can do that through the modeling information that they put into the tool.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. Okay. Michael asks, are these damage costs inflation adjusted? I think that's in reference to slides 19 to 21, some of the economic impacts and event-based damage quantification. And Michael, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong.
Yep, we do take into account the inflation, especially when we're starting to do the ROI calculations, where we take into account not just the cost, but also the benefits or the savings. We do apply an inflation adjustment.
And I should also add that that was annualized damages. So the probability of any given event happening in any given year, it wasn't saying that that damage was occurring in that year. So those are annualized average. It's used more for a sort of reserve budget type perspective.
Okay, good. Question from David McLeod. It's more of a, if you have time to discuss. So damage reduction opportunities as a percentage of damage does not seem to be all that good. Yes, worth taking action, but kind of disappointing to see that lots of damage will still occur.
So again, I think it's, I think the point in that one was more that our traditional approach to damage, to just simply putting in perhaps storm ponds or looking at green development standards as the answer, is not going to help when you have existing urban areas that need to be retrofitted. We have to make investment at the lot level. That requires us to work with partners. So it requires us to work with private sector, the industrial commercial sector, to put it, to provide incentives through stormwater credits. It requires us to engage residents. And so you're right, David, it can be a little bit disheartening to see that, in these older, well-established municipalities that were built prior to flood control, we do need to go back and we need to retrofit. Simply putting in new development that meets today's standards isn't good enough. And given, David, I know you well, so I know you know this when it comes to electricity and GHG emissions. You know, so much of Toronto has been built already, my home, for example. So we're not going to reach our targets if we're just relying on new development. We've got to go back and make people like me, you know, reduce my energy consumption, reduce my driving habits, and buy a better car. And so, so these are the kinds of things that are going to require us all to adapt. And I think that's the story that needs to be portrayed. That we can't put our eggs all into new development. We have to go back and retrofit existing. And hopefully, you know, in 6 months' time and a year from now, when we've analyzed some of these other results, we can share more examples with you.
David, did you have a comment?
No, only, you know, just to say, thanks for clarifying there. I mean, in terms of people at the lot level, I mean, do you have any sense of what it would cost per say residential property for them to get some substantial improvement in their risk of damage?
So I think it really depends. Again, one of the things that I'm always cautious of is understanding what caused the flooding. So if you go back to that very first slide, there could be, the person could be flooded due to riverine, urban overland, sanitary groundwater, or multiple. And this is why it's important that you overlay those different flood types, because one of the things we found is that some properties are actually exposed to all, you know, maybe exposed to more than one type of flooding. And so it requires a multiple barrier approach, not just, you know, putting in a berm for riverine flooding, maybe, you know, or not just putting in a backwater valve. And so it's so important for us first to step back and say, why is this property flooding? Because, and then targeting the solution, the appropriate solution. So I know I'm not giving you a direct answer, but I think that one of the things that I looked at was, I live in a high risk flood area, and due to sanitary backup, it's an older area. And so I looked at the fact that when I got robbed, within a week, I bought ADT security. And I thought, why didn't I get ADT security beforehand? Because it might have prevented me from getting robbed in the first place. When you start to look at damages due to flooding, they can be, you know, in excess of $40,000. So actually putting in a rain garden for $5,000 or $10,000, or putting in a backwater valve for $1,000, the cost benefit to that property owner in reducing or mitigating that risk is quite huge, right? If I look at my neighborhood, I mentioned that in 2008 and in 2013, we had a 100-year flood or 100-year storm. In 2020, we had a 100-year storm. So I didn't get flooded, but my neighbors down the street did. And so, you know, ask them, that's, you know, could be $80,000 in damages plus mortgages that they also have to house. So putting in a $5,000 rain garden or permeable pavement, or, you know, regrading their slopes, small price to pay for averting damages.
Okay, thanks so much for that. I will keep to my plans on putting in a rain garden this summer then. I will not abandon those. Good, good. Okay, let's go on to Susanna. Did you consider antecedent moisture conditions or seasonality in these scenarios?
I just wanted to clarify what's being referred to when we say scenarios. Perhaps we're talking about the management scenarios, but I did want to reiterate that the tool is an event-based tool. So we generally look at the typical design storm, so 2, 5, 10, all the way up to the 100-year storm, and it's not a continuous model. I don't know if that answers the question, but I did want to clarify what was meant by scenarios.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Amna. And I think the other thing with respect to the RROIT tool, when I think I'm going to mention that when we were developing the tool, we went out to about 60 municipalities across Canada, and we asked them what tools they had available, what models they had available. And the predominant type of model was event-based, not continuous.
Yeah.
And so that's why the tool currently in version 1 is event-based, which doesn't consider antecedent conditions. But what our monitoring staff have seen is that, you know, in the end, you have some events where you have dry soil conditions where you get increased, enhanced infiltration, other cases where, as you know, to your point of antecedent conditions, where you might have saturated soils and less infiltration. So I think one of the things that, again, we're considering as part of version 3, perhaps, is the opportunity for the risk tool to incorporate continuous input, but that's not something at this stage that the tool does. It's event-based.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Baya has the question, what is the NPV rate used for these calculations?
Oh, okay. But I'm assuming, or clarify for me, please. I think, do you mean the discount rate that is used to calculate the net present value? If
Yes.
so, that's 3%. I think it was
3%.
3% discount rate that was applied.
In this particular example, right? That can also be adjusted. So, but in this particular case, that was used.
Thanks. Okay, Michelle asks, or comments, this is a very exciting tool, I agree. Can the scenario function consider combined more than one management option?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So, I think one of the things that we'll be doing in the future scenarios that we can present, you know, down the road in 6 months or so, is that those scenarios that I talked about, where you have different LID and storm pond scenarios, or even natural assets combined. So yes, the tool can allow you to do multiple management scenarios. That's really what we wanted to have the tool be able to do, because, you know, to the earlier point when I was talking with David, not all flooding is the same, and so not all solutions are the same. So it doesn't all fit one box. So yes.
Okay, Baya asks, is this tool, can it be used by other municipalities in Canada? If yes, is there a demo that can be tried?
So as I mentioned, one of the things that we developed this tool for our municipal partners, but we have received a lot of interest in the tool, and we're looking with our partners, Risk Science Institute and Climate Risk Institute, for opportunities to use the tool in other locations. So if you are interested in running the tool, please feel free to reach out to Amna and I, and we will connect you to our partners. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sarah, can this tool in the future be applied to more structural infrastructure rather than just natural assets?
So the tool does currently consider structural infrastructure. So it does look at both public and private buildings potentially being impacted by the various types of flooding. We also look at roads and railways that are potentially at risk of inundation under the various return period storm, and if that triggers a repair. As part of the erosion component module of the tool, I know we didn't get into a lot of depth today, but that erosion module does look at determining overtopping and scouring damage to bridges. So that component is currently applicable within the tool. And I think just based on terminology, when Christine and I say natural assets with respect to this tool, we're talking about it from a mitigation measure perspective, like what are the different options that you can apply, so namely wetlands, forests, and open space. But the tool itself is a watershed-based tool, and it does look at the structural infrastructure as well.
Very interesting. And is there a cost to use the tool?
So again, one of the things, we're a conservation authority. So again, this idea of when we developed the tool, we developed it for our municipal partners. And we just completed version 1, and we've seen a lot of expression of interest outside of our watershed. So we're working with Climate Risk Institute and Risk Science International to look at how we might roll this out to a broader audience. We're also hoping to reach out to our Conservation Authority partners to see how they might be able to help and work with us. But it definitely is a tool that a lot of municipalities have expressed interest in. So we would like to share that tool. So if you are interested, feel free to email Amna or I. We will connect you with Climate Risk Institute. If you're a conservation authority, please reach out to me if you're interested. We'll look at how we might be able to work together collectively. But it's something that we're looking at different opportunities to roll out the tool. I know it's not a direct answer, so unfortunately I don't have that. Again, it would also depend on which modules you want to use and what information you have available. I'm going to mention that some municipalities that may not have a lot of wealth of information, we use different GIS methods to get at the question of urban flooding. If you're data rich, you may want to do a lot of the different modules. And so again, it really depends on how many scenarios, what model and information you have, which may require more input and information to deal with.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your questions and comments. Really insightful. And thanks so much, Christine and Amna, for the fantastic presentation.